Hello, friends. This is Wednesday's work. So this is Women and Families in Classical Society. Um, there is a thing here that this is not the Song Dynasty. This is actually the Han Dynasty. So we're going to look at the early Han Dynasty. I am writing with my right hand, and it's really weird. Yay, Han Dynasty. So during the early period, women did have legal rights. They could own property, they had inheritance. Although there seems to be, through the Han Dynasty, there is a reduction in these sorts of rights. And so this article looks at women and families and how a family system kind of existed or coexisted in Han China, but it also does some comparisons with ancient Rome that I find really fascinating. And so I'll go ahead and read this for you. So, again, we're talking about what is called this classical period. This is between 600 BC and 600 AD, or sorry, I'm grabbing my coffee, as Khan Academy uses, they use BCE and CE, or before Common Era and Common Era. So many influential belief systems developed and evolved into more complex institutions, which are established laws, practices, or customs. Institutions often influence how communities are organized. And so if we think about this too, like in our own society, think about how these institutions, these laws, these practices, how these sorts of things affect our social structure. How does school affect our social structure? How does this affect the way we are? So these institutions affected communities by altering social structures like family and marriage, which had a large impact on the lives of women and children. During this period, women had comparatively less power than their male counterparts, but they still lived very diverse lives. Based on research from primary and secondary sources, we know that women exercised varying degrees of freedom and independence in the private and public world due to different belief systems, family relations, political contexts, and social classes. So the first thing we'll look at are belief systems. Belief systems, philosophies, and religions may seem to exist simply in the world of ideas, but they have considerable effects on people's daily lives. Over time, concepts become parts of institutions that include rules and expectations for how people relate to one another. This is particularly true in the way women live in relation to their male counterparts and to society in general. For example, women in China experienced very different social roles under Confucianism and Taoism. Based on its written rules, Taoism gave more leeway for women to play active roles in religion and to make decisions about their lives. The written rules of Confucianism limited women's power more severely, but it is unclear whether women actually abided by these rules in all cases. As with any religious or moral system, there is a difference between rules and how they are actually practiced. And here's a comparison between the belief system on Confucianism in Han China. So Confucianism, the views on women, filial piety, so piety for the family. So there's one of these great words. Filial piety required that people respect their elders and ancestors, especially male ones. The ideal role for women was to take care of a large household. Women didn't typically have formal roles in Confucian life outside of the home. So think about this in the case of, if you're familiar with the movie Mulan, right? Filial piety, respect for elders, respect for the ancestors. So the philosophies here, both Confucianism and Taoism, have the concept of yin and yang, or duality. I talked about this last week, where we have the yin yang symbol, a light on one side and dark on the other. Women were seen as part of the yin, yielding, submissive, soft, etc. And that's the white. Men are seen as part of the yang, aggressive, powerful, etc. So their duality, there's two of them. You can have one without the other. For Taoism, women were allowed to be priests and teachers in the Taoist tradition. In the classical Taoist text, the Tao Te Ching, feminine characteristics such as fertility, softness, and submission are seen as positive and respected features. In Taoism, the female contribution as the yin is more respected than it is in Confucianism. It is seen as a part of nature. Taoism suggests that a softer, more yielding attitude may eventually lead to more favorable results. In many societies, women's primary roles revolved around motherhood and managing a household. While women in many historical contexts and different locations had this in common, there were significant differences in how women performed these roles depending on kinship relations. And kinship was part of this idea that we saw yesterday with legalism and the Qin Empire. Kinship is a broad concept that encompasses familial relationships, like those of common descent, blood relation, and marriage. We can compare different kinship relations within one society. In Han China, a woman's power in a particular household depended on how she related to the men in the family. This can be seen in the Confucian principle of the three obediences. And this is important too, this idea of three obediences. So this is Confucianism. According to this principle, a woman's first obedience is to her father before she is married, to her husband while she is married, and to her son after her husband dies. During the course of their lives, women were dependent on their male kin, but they had different levels of power depending on their age and influence over male family members. Mothers of influential older sons, for example, exercised far greater control over household affairs than a younger son's new bride. This is something to remember here. We've seen this again and again and again when we look at history, that women were dependent on their male kin. We've talked about this before. We talked about this with ancient Rome. We'll look at this too in the concepts of women's roles in ancient India. And think about this too in the relationship of even modern day America or in Europe or even throughout history. In this way, Chinese thinkers of the Han Dynasty understood the family as the core unit. So again, the core unit of the Han Dynasty, or the core unit of the family, this is the core unit. Men were formally the heads of the family and exercised legal power over the women and children in the household. Imperial Rome was similar in that the paterfamilias, this is Latin for father of the family, it's paterfamilias, was legally responsible for the family unit. In both societies, women exercised some legal power. For example, Roman women could own property and inherit after the deaths of their fathers. In Han China, the wills of women reveal that some older women held property, inherited assets, and managed businesses. Similarly, despite strict laws, both elite and ordinary women in Imperial Rome regularly bought and sold property with apparently very few limits on their freedom. This suggests that formal roles for women were not always followed, and that women often had informal power. While the two societies share these similarities, they were different in other significant ways. For example, while women in Han China were mostly limited to separate women's spaces, Roman homes were not formally segregated. Roman women were confined to the back rows of theaters and arenas, but they had more of a role in public life than their Han China counterparts. Han women were mostly limited to the private domestic sphere, or the household. This can be seen in the fact that Roman women often dined with men, gasp, and visited public baths, double gasp, something women in Han China would not have been permitted to do. So Table 2 compares the formal legal status, economic power, and roles of public life in women in Han China versus Imperial Rome. And you can see here the comparison between the two. What was their role in public life? What was their economic power? And what was their formal, mind you, legal status? Although it appears sometimes this was not always the case, that there were exceptions to the rule. Because the majority of primary sources about women's lives come from wealthy people, scholars don't always know how the lives of families living in poverty played out. However, we can deduce that there were differences between elite and common women. In Han China, the ability to keep a large household with lots of family members was highly valued. But this Confucian ideal was not possible for families with fewer economic resources who could only feed a limited number of people. Men with less money often sold their daughters as servants and kept their more valuable male children at home. In Imperial Rome, women of different socioeconomic classes were distinguished by clothing style. Women with more socioeconomic power wore a long dress or stola and a loose coat called a palla. They also wore ties in their hair. Prostitutes wore togas. If a woman of a higher socioeconomic class was found guilty of adultery, one of the punishments was to wear a toga. The distinction Imperial Roman society made between these two groups was more than just a moral one. Prostitutes and women of lower socioeconomic levels were often given fewer rights than women of a higher social status.